Fitness Pro Mentor community, I'm really excited for today's episode. As you know, in this little community, we love helping personal trainers develop their business and learn as much as they can about what they do with their clients. And we've had some incredible guests in the past, but today I have two returning guests, and we're going to do a little powwow. I'm a little out of my wheelhouse, but I'm really excited about it. But let's bring in the first guest just to get this thing started right off the bat. We have the handsome, the muscular, the anti-aging machine, Jacques H. Newll-Taylor. Jacques, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, thanks. Good to see you, man.
We get a sax solo today?
If we have enough time, yeah.
Sure. Excellent. So Jacques and I were talking about like potential collaborations that we could do. We went through a few different guests, and you said, you know, there's this guy who's doing some really incredible stuff and really game-changing in the industry. And that guy is Mr. Evan Peikon. Evan, how you doing, sir?
Doing pretty good, man. I didn't get the handsome and muscular.
Oh, no. Well, I didn't see the also handsome and muscular.
Okay.
Evan
Okay.
Peikon.
Thank you. It's a little bit less meaningful, and you have to prompt it yourself, but it's fine.
Listen, nothing from you, but this Jacques guy, I mean, he just doesn't age. He looks the exact same from when I met 15 years ago to now. Like, I mean, he looks exactly the same. It's incredible.
Very kind of you, but dude, no. I'm wearing every bit of 52, that's for sure.
50, but you can see the top of your clavicular pec here busting out. So that's, you know, a clear sign. Anyway, I mean, to kick this whole thing off, I mean, both of you are absolutely brilliant minded and with, you know, your own respective passions within this fitness industry. So I'm really excited to dive into this. I mean, Jacques, you don't mind me asking you, where do you think we should start?
Oh, well, really checking in with, you know, Evan about what he's up to, because like I said, I think what was really excited about coming across what Evan is up to is being able to explore what is happening inside the human body while you're doing an exercise, other than just looking at heart rate, right, and HRV and stuff like that. So this idea that there are other things that you can look at in real time, as opposed to something like surface electromyography, where you look at it, but then you have to analyze the data like an hour, 2-3 hours later, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, just checking in with Evan about, well, like, what is he up to, and yeah, what's he excited about that he can talk about?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I've been bouncing around a lot over the past few months, but I think you hit on something that I'm really interested in, which is that we're interested in using these different technologies, but analyzing the data is always a problem, both because we need to do it retroactively, but also there's so much information in this biological data that we're collecting that it's really hard to actually parse out everything in there. So one of the big things that I've been interested in over the past year or two is different ways of analyzing data using machine learning and applying methods that have been around for a long time in other industries and applying them to the type of data that we're collecting as coaches or athletes or fitness professionals. Also just a big recurring theme for me for a few years now, but I'm still interested in this and looking at it through different lenses is integrative physiology. You also had mentioned heart rate. It's probably the most ubiquitous measure that you could find in fitness. Every device measures it, but heart rate is such a small part of how we get blood to the periphery. And this is going to probably rub some people the wrong way, but I think even cardiac output isn't that useful of a measurement. I think we're so fixated on what's happening centrally, heart, pulmonary system, in the periphery is so neglected, both, I mean, ironically, as people that are interested in muscle hypertrophy, which is really training the periphery a lot, but even from an endurance athlete perspective, a health and medical perspective, people don't think about how blood flow is regulated in the extremities. I'll go on to give a little spoiler. Heart rate has very little to do with it. It's not the thing that's driving blood flow to the peripheral tissues. That's something that's always interesting to me as well.
Evan, when we did our little podcast with you and me, you said something like very softly, and you were talking about, you know, if you have an athlete and they're struggling to meet an objective, and perhaps when you're checking the measurements, even though they can't make that endurance, there's so many different things between potentially it's their heart rate, potentially it's their oxygen intake and their lung capacity, potentially if they get that pooling in their leg, that there might be some local periphery issues with how their body's managing blood flow and really everything to that end. And I have to say, like, again, I'm a little out of my wheelhouse and I'm really excited to be here, but I was just wondering, like, could you speak a little bit more to that? Because I tell you, when one of my clients gets tired, the questions I ask now have completely changed since our episode. And it's even the little bit of information I get qualitatively has been very helpful.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally when we're thinking about like how do people sustain activity, how do people power activity in general, one of the things that's missing, and I think this is largely one, it's the fact that even established scientific findings don't end up in textbooks or educational curriculum for years after the fact. I mean, I've listened to podcasts that the two of you have done in the past, and you're talking about things that, I mean, went to university and I studied neuroscience for a period. I didn't learn about most of these things because you guys are talking about topics that are from past 5-10 years. One of the big ones is all three of us, when we were in school, probably 9th or 10th or 11th grade, taking biology, they teach us about the respiratory cycle. Everyone's heard of this. You breathe oxygen in, you breathe carbon dioxide out. It's pretty straightforward. Somehow they missed the third gas. The third gas is nitric oxide. So it is true that we breathe oxygen and we breathe carbon dioxide out, but without nitric oxide, a specific form of it, that oxygen can't actually get into the tissues. So there's even research that they're mutant mouse models. They've done these experiments where it's a knock-in model, so they add an extra amino acid. So these mice have completely normal oxygen levels, and their tissues are hypoxic. And you're like, how the hell is that possible? They have high oxygen levels, but their tissues are hypoxic. They're bred to lack nitric oxide. So the oxygen can't actually get into the tissues. And these mice develop the mouse equivalent of dementia in just a few weeks. If you startle them, they'll have a heart attack. They'll get an ischemic heart. And we're talking about mutant mice. Obviously, it's much different than people, but a lack of this same bioactive form of nitric oxide in a human being has a whole host of health implications. It can lead to neurovascular dementia. It can lead to cardiovascular disease. These are well-established findings, but for us as fitness practitioners, there's also an important component. People can't oxygenate their tissues properly, so they will fatigue quickly. Their tissues can't utilize oxygen. If you can't utilize oxygen in a tissue, you can't hypertrophy that tissue. You can't sustain activity. So there's a whole huge component of integrative physiology that's very often overlooked. And when we could start to talk about things like nitric oxide activity, we could start getting into this like multitude of different things that regulate blood flow, because the same form of nitric oxide that guides oxygen into the tissue is also one of the principal vasodilators in a tissue. If you can't vasodilate, you can't get blood in. And this is why earlier I said heart rate. It's important, but not so much so. Think of how many orders of magnitude could your heart rate increase from rest? Right now, I'm probably at about 50 beats per minute. I could quadruple that, get up to 200 beats per minute. My cardiac output could increase by a few multiples. So your blood vessels could vasodilate, and that is raised to the fourth power. So every tiny little change in a blood vessel's diameter has a humongous impact on blood flow. So what's really driving blood flow to the periphery is how much you can dilate those blood vessels. If you can't dilate them and you lack this nitric oxide, it doesn't matter if you could get your heart rate up to 400 beats per minute. It's not going to do that much. So it opens up a whole door of different things that we could talk about. I know that was kind of a little bit of a ramble, so hopefully that was...
I get the feeling, Evan, that this is one of the leading edges that you're exploring right now with your latest venture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is definitely involved. Yeah.
Supplemental nitric oxide. Listen, muscle tech.
Yeah.
Is it hot garbage?
I don't know what's in that specifically, but I will say, I don't want to say all, because obviously I don't know every supplement in the world. The vast majority of supplements that are meant to increase nitric oxide don't increase nitric oxide. It's unfortunate, but the bioactive form of nitric oxide, you can't get in a supplement. There's no pharmaceutical drugs on the market that increase it. So I can't talk about everything that I do for work. I will say we don't sell supplements. We don't make anything. So it has nothing to do with ingesting anything.
There's an interesting thing. Some of the advances that we will make in, I'll call it exercise design, right? Designing exercise for people to help them achieve whatever goals, whether it's health or performance, longevity, what have you, is driven simply by curiosity of how things work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I know that there was a chunk of my career where I try to suppress my natural curiosity of just how stuff works, not for the sake of I want to get a muscle bigger, but just what's going on in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is interesting is when we get too focused on a single outcome, we then start to lose that curiosity about how stuff works, and we miss out on even exploring. Well, wait a minute, yeah, there is oxygen in. CO2 out, but yeah, what about the other stuff that has to go in too, right? Like nitric oxide, and having our curiosity, so then we can perhaps apply that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just kind of cool that there's this need for exploration for how things work, just so that we can be better at designing specific applications.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of what makes me interested in like high performance or interested in hypertrophy is it's like a shell to help you understand something else. So like muscle hypertrophy, it's very easy to see. A muscle grows or it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So you could experiment with X, Y, or Z and do research, and it's just a very tangible way to see if what you're experimenting with is having an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So like for me, the reason I got interested in high performance in general, hypertrophy, endurance training, whatever it is it's just an outlet or an excuse to do research. And then, if your research is working, if you get a better result or not. So it's just like a tangible version of that. But yeah, I think because people are very good at getting these specific training outcomes, we assume that we actually know what's happening in the body. I think we're very far from that. I'm not saying I have all of these answers. I think any one person is scratching the surface. So I think it's worth considering that, yeah, we might not come up with better training methods to produce certain outcomes, but that doesn't mean that we actually know why things are happening. And that's what's so interesting to me, starting to peel back these layers. And maybe when we get closer and closer to the truth with a capital T, if that even exists, maybe there is something more to performance. Maybe what we think are the limits are not the limits, and things can be done in better ways, and we're really just on the precipice. I mean, the fact that there are individuals still accomplishing things that no one thought would be possible. Eliud Kipchoge ran a sub 2-hour marathon. That shouldn't have happened anytime soon. It just kind of came out of the blue. Well, yeah, he has great genetics for endurance training. You look at Phil Heath and you're like, man, is someone going to get more muscular than him? He probably has great genetics for bodybuilding. What do you think the chances are that he actually has the best genetics for bodybuilding? It seems pretty unlikely to me that some niche sport that doesn't attract a huge body of talent, that we've already found like the perfect human being for any of these activities. So I think that's what's going to become so interesting. Even if we could understand what the limits of performance are, think of how much better we could do at talent identification if we really knew what was driving these performance outcomes, and we could actually find the people that really have the best genetics for those activities. Maybe like a 145 marathon, or maybe you could have a lean, natural 275-pound guy at 5'10". I mean, these things aren't against the laws. They don't defy the laws of physics. So, I mean, maybe that is possible.
Evan, when we spoke last, I literally got in my car and was like, I should have asked this question, because I feel like it's like the simplest, broadest stroke question. And I talked to Jacques on the phone. I'm like, listen, I'm going to ask this question next time, because I think it's an easy one. And I think it will help give everyone who's listening to this a bit more framing. If we take a well-trained athlete, middle-aged, 20 to 30 years old, no problems, best conditions, clean palate. And I said, Evan, make this guy grow as much muscle and get as big as possible, as fast as possible. What do you do? And pardon me if that's lame, but I would love to hear your thoughts around that.
I was going to say, is pharmacological intervention on the table here?
Let's start with just the training methods.
Yeah, so I mean, the reality is I don't know if the training would be that different than what people already know works. I think it would just be a little bit more specific. So I mean, I know a lot of what Jacques does is finding exercises that are going to be maximally effective for people. What I've wondered myself is taking these very nuanced approaches to training, do we actually raise the ceiling? Do we raise someone's natural ceiling, or do we just get them there quicker? In my experience, it appears to me that we just get people there quicker, but we may not be raising the ceiling of what they could eventually do. And I've seen this working with elite CrossFit athletes and endurance athletes. Traditionally, we might think that someone needs 10 years or 15 years of training to reach their natural peak. I think as training gets more and more nuanced and more specific and more personalized for the individual, I think it might just be cutting down the amount of time that it takes someone to get to that limit versus really pushing them any higher. Because you look at a lot of high-level athletes, a lot of them hit their peak early in their career and they just kind of coast. And what makes someone great is their ability to stay in peak condition for long periods of time without getting hurt. So I know this is a super lame answer because it's not like, oh, we'll give them all these crazy protocols. It's really just going to be using whatever technologies we have available to individualize their training and getting them to their peak as early as we can without hurting them. But I don't think we're necessarily going to take this average guy with good genetics and turn him into some kind of mutant. I don't think that that's ever going to be possible.
Fair enough. Very fair.
I totally agree with that. And I think the other part that I guess a skillful exercise professional can do is, as opposed to an unskilled scenario where this person could get injured, or they may start to burn out, or may not understand about the need for rest and recovery, and that prolongs their journey to their best selves and provides a lot of opportunities for them to just go, forget about it. This is not working.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that not getting burnt out or injured is such a huge component of it. I've seen this a lot working with high-level CrossFit athletes because CrossFit's a painful sport. I mean, if someone really wants to be very competitive and compete at the games, most days of the week are going to suck, and it's going to require a lot of willpower and motivation. What prevents most people from actually reaching that level is one of two things. It's either they're just going to get sick of being uncomfortable again and again, and they're going to give up prematurely. So having more skillful exercise selection and exercise programming perhaps could get them to that high level without having to suffer as much and have wasted efforts. You could be really focused with where you put their efforts. And the other one is people just get injured. You know that to be competitive in most athletic domains requires a lot of volume. And what stops most very genetically gifted people isn't that they can't adapt, it's that they hurt themselves. And this is something that I learned a while ago doing some consulting and applied physiology work in professional sports, which is bringing all these different technologies to professional sport teams. They don't care about getting an NFL player stronger at a quicker rate or getting them faster at a quicker rate. These guys are all genetic freaks. They're going to get strong and they're going to get fast. They could probably do the worm and put 30 pounds on their bench press if they really wanted to, and they were good enough at doing the worm. It's that these guys just get injured from training. So I think that's really the most important thing once you get to this high level, just stop people from hurting themselves so they can just accumulate sufficient volume to actually adapt.
Yeah, that's incredible. Really, really incredible. Today I have a client that I've been seeing for about 6 years, and he's a retired NHL athlete, and he is the quintessential he actually got injured working out with the late Charles Poliquin very early in his career, ironically enough. And that injury kind of snowballed into him having a bigger injury and stopped him from playing in the NHL. But what was really interesting this morning, we just got a brand new Kaiser functional trainer that measures peak force, and I'm really excited about it. And we were playing around with it with him because we've been working on trunk rotation for a while. And we did some quick 1 RM peak force, and he got like 545 newtons or however that machine expresses the peak force measurement. And then I said, you know what, let's try something with you. We're going to try and see what you can do for 20 reps and see what happens when you fatigue, what your percentage drops to as you start to get a bit tired. And this was a lot of resistance, and he's a big guy and he's 50 something now. Well, he did 20 reps, and of the 20 reps, he stayed on both right and left within 90% of his peak force for 20 reps.
Wow.
And what was really neat about it for him is when he came back and reflected on it as an athlete was that he was never like the superstar high speed player, but he was the workhorse guy that just never stopped. And he had that hard work ethic. But it was really neat to see that his physiology actually reflected his mentality, and that he just had that mentality to keep going. And he literally mechanically stayed there. It was just really fascinating. I thought it'd be kind of fun to bring up today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is something that you see in a lot of sports, and it kind of gets into like endurance running. There's always these debates, like a speed king is endurance king, and it's kind of a silly question because both of them are obviously important. But you see these two distinct types of athletes. Of course, it's a spectrum, but there are some individuals with really high top speed, but their ability to sustain high percentages of their max speed is terrible. Then there are individuals who their top speed isn't as good, but they could sustain very high percentages of it. This is where you get to one way to create individualization in training is for that athlete who's already very fast. We don't need to get them more powerful. We don't need to get them more speed. We need to bring up that floor so they could sustain higher percentages of their max speed. That athlete who's already able to hold close to their max speed, what are you going to do in the way of endurance training? What are you going to get them from holding 98% of their max speed to 98.7? That's not going to have any real return on investment.
Right.
So you need to get them more powerful. And this is where I don't know if there's necessarily a strong parallel in strength sports or hypertrophy training, but I think there's some idea of finding what someone's rate limiting factor is. Maybe for muscle growth, there is a very distinct rate limiting factor. And it may even be bioenergetic that is stopping someone from accumulating volume, for example, and then going after that low-hanging fruit so you could get more return on investment. Essentially, if you're going to be putting time and effort into something, it might as well be making you better at what you want to get better at.
I love it. Jacques, when we were chatting, you had some beautiful diagrams that you'd been kind of messing around with. I was wondering, do you want to jump into those and explore a little bit? Oh, Jacques, I'm afraid we can't hear you right now. Your mic's not coming through just at the moment.
How about that?
Yep.
There's that sexy voice.
So, I'd love to jump into that. But to provide some context for it, what I'm always interested in is trying to kind of refine the picture that's in my head. You know, like the picture in my head sometimes starts off as a cartoon. I'm trying to fill in enough details that it looks more like a drawing as opposed to like a cartoon, you know? And again, what I realized when I first came across what you look at and study so much, Evan, is I realized that I had a very, very cartoonish image in my head of metabolism within a muscle, right? I had a red looking fiber, and I had a white looking fiber. And I knew that when I did this really fast, that this fiber did it. And then when I did stuff slow, it was this fiber that did it. And every now and then you could trick them to get some sort of a crossover weird thing in the middle of it, okay? That was my physiology hat. With the neuroscience hat, I was like, that doesn't happen. That's not the way this happens. All these guys get recruited in this kind of interesting way, and it changes with every rep and it changes with every set, but I couldn't pull those two things together. It just felt like a what? It felt like we were talking about two entirely different systems, which made me want to see if I could do a little bit more exploring of what happens between the first rep in a set and the last rep in a set. Like, really, what is the difference between rep number 2 and rep number 6? Yeah. Rep number 1 and rep number 4, from a metabolic perspective, and also from a motor unit recruitment perspective. Like, how can we begin to look at that stuff? And really, where I am right now, I'm not so much. I'm just looking at it, and the the arbitrary, well, not arbitrary, but the stopping point is when you can no longer perform the rep at the prescribed rate. So in this case, it was a deadlift going like a 3-second eccentric and a 3-second concentric. And as soon as you can no longer do that, you put the weight down and you continue to do the set with no weight until the time was up, that kind of a deal.
Yep.
So I wanted to see if I could start to understand some of the talked about phenomena that people talk about, but then also maybe have a better understanding of, make it a little less cartoonish about this relationship between the metabolic machinery that might be dominant in one muscle fiber versus the metabolic machinery that might be dominant in another, and how that lactic, acid is the wrong word, right? But lactic something.
Yeah, lactate.
Yeah, lactate, excuse me, how the lactate is maybe shuttled from this guy, to this guy,
Yep.
right? If that makes sense. So tell me what you think of this. So I have to do my little share deal here. Okay, window, I'm gonna go here. So, so the first thing we're looking at is just a normal surface electromyography of me doing some deadlifts, and I'm going to actually refresh the screen. And the reason why there are 4 channels being shown here, because the sensor that I'm using has 4 little heads that are looking at the same muscle, and you can kind of think of it as it's trying to look at it with 4 different views to confirm that it's seeing what it thinks it's seeing. So we got these 4 channels here. And if you look at this, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 reps. And when you're looking at surface EMG stuff, there's nothing to try to glean from looking at a raw signal. So let's look at something that might be helpful, like let's look at the motor units. All right. So this thing, what this software does is it breaks down this EMG signal into the individual motor units. And it's pretty cool because it actually will tell you its confidence about the motor unit. So right now it says that, look, we had about 28 motor units that was able to tease out in this deadlift in the hamstring muscle. And each one of these motor units, you can see the 4 different channels kind of saying, yep, this is what we're seeing. So that's why you see the 4 different channels for each of those 28 motor units. And I should say that if you were to count each one of these individual things, you actually see fewer than 26 of these 4 unit packages, because it eliminates anything that it says is less than 80% confident that we are indeed looking at a motor unit. So these are the individual motor units that are in this hamstring, and we've got 28 of them that are identified by this algorithm. Does that make sense so far? I can't see your faces right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So, and a motor unit, again, is if you have an alpha motor neuron sitting in the spinal cord, it's going to innervate a specific group of muscle cells, and all the muscle cells that it innervates with that alpha motor neuron, that constitutes a motor unit for all of our colleagues out there. So these are all the different motor units. Now it'd be interesting to see that these big motor units right here, the like number 28, this happens to have a pretty high amplitude. So we can assume that this is a larger alpha motor neuron. And then we've got the smaller guy right here, all the way at the other end of the spectrum, motor unit number 1, which is a smaller one. And what's interesting is we can actually see the firing rate of each one of these motor units for each repetition of this exercise. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to look at, let's look at the firings, boom, like that. Okay, so.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's like, it really blew my mind when I got a hold of this stuff. So the red, or I guess this is magenta down here, these would be some of those really small motor units. And as you can see, they start to fire first and they fire more frequently, right? And this is grouped into, well, naturally grouped into the different reps. So this would be my first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh rep, okay? And as we're looking at this, as we're going from the bottom up to the top, these are our larger motor units up here, and they are not firing as frequently. But here's the cool thing. I was in the assumption, as of probably 5 years ago, that these guys up here didn't jump in until sometime like, before you were like, about to puke on the floor, but they actually participate right off the bat. Okay. And the frequency of their participation changes. So I'm setting this all up so that we can look at something called a regression analysis, so we can appreciate how a group of motor units that's participating in the very first rep might be changing as we get to the last rep. Does that make any sense?
Yep.
Okay. So why don't we go like this then? Oh, there's one other cool thing to look at. We're going to look at the firing rates. So, that's kind of neat too. So each one of these peaks represents, I should say that not just the peak, but as we come down into a trough, represents a rep. And the red, remember the red or the magenta, those are the smaller motor units, and they have the highest firing rates. And these darker, the purple motor units, they have the lower firing rates, right? Firing rate over on this side, and then we have time over here as we go through. So we can see that there are actual changes in the peak firing rates. Big peak firing rate in the first rep, and it drops off in the next rep, right? So there's some difference in the behavior of the muscle from rep to rep. It could be, substitution patterns. It could be another phenomenon called potentiation, and we'll take a closer look at that in a moment too. So this is what we're trying to get to, this regression deal. Let's go to this regression. Okay, and you know what? What I did, let's back up. Sorry, guys. I'm going to back up to this, back to that. Let's go back to the firing rates. Okay. The other thing that I thought would be very useful is to try to understand what's happening with a concentric contraction versus the eccentric. So what I did was I used the accelerometer data to determine where I was in the range of motion, so I could section off the concentric from the eccentric phases. So I'll plot those now, and there we have it, right? So each one of those little overlays kind of shows us the section of the motor unit behavior or activity that is attributed to just the concentric phase of each of those contractions. So now we can actually pull out some statistics and look at a regression, looking at, what's happening with each one of these repetitions for the concentric phase in terms of the firing rate. So the way this is laid out is this is a relatively low amplitude, right? So we could call this the lower amplitude motor units. And then out here, we get to the higher amplitude motor units, right? That have the bigger waveform. So as the amplitude goes up, the firing rate goes down. Yeah.
Yep.
For the very first repetition, we had, this is our distribution for the firing rate. And for each one of these reps after that, the firing rate goes up, right? Mm-hmm. Gets a little bit closer right there, okay? And I also have the SMO2 data for this too, for this first set. And you see let's see if I have that really easily right here. Could I show that really easily? I think that's going to be too fancy for me to try to switch screens, but but I do have the SMO2 data for this, and they keep telling me at Delsis that at some point toward the end of the year, they're going to have all this in one software package. I'll believe it when I see it, but that'll be pretty cool if they can do it. But check this out. This is the thing that really I thought was really interesting. I'm going to look at the second set. Okay, we're going to do the same regression analysis on the second set. Now look at this. This bright orange right here is the first set, or excuse me, is the first rep. Okay, and I have a specific firing rate distribution going all the way out here to the larger motor units. And then when I go for my second, right, for my second concentric contraction, there's actually a lower firing rate. So again, there's one of two things could be, well, not one of two, a couple of things come to mind that could be happening. One, there could be some sort of substitution where I'm getting more glute participation in this exercise. But If all things are the same, then what I might have here is a great example of something called potentiation, where you don't have to use as much neurologic energy to get the same amount of tension in the tissue, because the tissue is now prepared for this activity. It's essentially warmed up, I guess would be a cool way of putting it, right? So we get this potentiation effect. Then I go up to my third concentric contraction, and the firing rate goes up. And then for my fourth, I get another bit of a potentiation effect, right? Because it's firing a little less frequently. And then by this fifth one, I get a whole lot more firing, right? And then that's where I failed. I knew that I couldn't keep the same pace. So for the last 2 reps that are over here, I put the bar down and continued to do the exercise. I didn't bother to plot those just because I thought it would be kind of confusing, because their rates are going to be way down here, right? So I share all that just to throw up this idea that I'm trying to understand how this change, or this change in firing rate for these motor units might be related to different metabolic characteristics. Oh, I should show you one other thing. This is the one that really kind of brings it home. We'll go to the very last set here. I'll plot this. Okay, yeah. So first set, second set, third set, right? We start to get much higher firing rates, but the firing rate for the larger motor units isn't quite that steep yet. And then for this very last set, we have a greater firing rate for the larger motor units, but a lower firing rate for the smaller motor units. And I'd never seen that before, and I haven't seen this reported faithfully in the literature either. But it made me think that it's not because it doesn't happen, but it's because they're not looking for it specifically. Mm-hmm. Right? In a research environment, rarely is failure defined this way, number one. And number two, I don't think that they just aren't curious about this kind of scenario. So I'm wondering if this is a case where, because of what is happening metabolically, right, in terms of what is happening with, if we look at the SMO2 values for this, we see that there's a much steeper desaturation, a much deeper desaturation for this last set than for the other 2 sets, even though we went to the same type of failure. Mm-hmm. So just a curiosity, just me geeking out and just having fun with this being able to see this stuff. What do you guys think?
So many things going through my head right now. One, something that I would love to see. So you have this potentiation effect that you see. There's so many different things going on. We're like, okay, is there something neurological creating those effects? Probably yes, to some degree. Is there something bioenergetic creating those effects? Yeah, probably to some degree. Imagine if we could separate these from one another. So something that I'm thinking, there's something called ischemic preconditioning. So if you imagine like a BFR cuff, typically if someone does BFR training, you pump it up to maybe 150 millimeters mercury of pressure. Mm-hmm. It's enough pressure that blood could still get into the limb, but it can't escape. And that's normal. It allows for the metabolic stress. What you never want to do when you're doing BFR training is to clamp down on your artery, which would mean no blood is getting into the limb, none is getting out. But when you are not exercising, you could intentionally pump up a cuff enough that you actually cut off arterial blood flow. So if you were to take a pulse rate with like a Doppler on your ankle, you would have no pulse because there's no blood getting in. Now, if you pump up the cuffs enough that you cut off blood flow entirely, and then you just hang out there for about 5 minutes, what's going to happen is your limbs are going to deoxygenate because you still have all these oxygen utilizing metabolic processes occurring. When you pull these cuffs off, you are going to get a huge overshoot in blood flow. So you're going to create a ton of vasodilation in all of those lower limbs of your body. Now, ordinarily, this would happen during exercise as well, but by the time you're maybe 3 sets in and you've accumulated a lot of these metabolites and you're very vasodilated, you've also done a lot of muscle work as well. What I'm wondering is, could you get this, what looks like the potentiation effect on the EMG, just by doing ischemic preconditioning without doing all these sets prior? And if so, does that point to the fact that there is a big metabolic component to this effect? Keep in mind, I have no idea what the answer to this is. It's just something that you're saying this, but I mean, I would love to see that data if you were able to do that.
I'm writing it down. Yeah.
Well, there's the two ends of it, because there's like the calcium sensitivity, the local periphery side of it, and then the alleged H reflex, which is much more like central. I mean, I couldn't see why that'd be such an incredible experiment to see if that made a change. Like, that would be wild. That'd be wild.
I think the other part that we have to figure out how to control for, at least, or to at least appreciate that it's happening, are any kind of substitutions, like getting a little bit more of this muscle participating so that one can back off. That's the big part of this that you can't possibly feel, that can definitely be a part of what's going on here.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part. I think there's also something to, we talk about these different like metabolic and neurological processes that are occurring and how they're changing both from set to set, but also within a set. This is where I think having something like machine learning becomes useful, because there's so many different dimensions of data that we're thinking about. There's so much information in these signals. It's just more than a human mind could comprehend, particularly when we think about how many different factors, like we think of muscle metabolism as one thing. There's so much redundancy and so many different things that are occurring simultaneously to regulate blood flow in a tissue and balance our blood pressure. The same thing, I'm sure there's a lot of information in the EMG signal. So it'd be interesting to really try and combine these data streams, because I mean, humans were good at thinking in 1, 2, 3 dimensions, but once you get up to maybe 15, 20 different dimensions of data, right. I mean, it just becomes too much to handle. And I think that's where, I mean, you're seeing breakthroughs in every field of science applying these tools. I think our industry hasn't really seen that yet, but I don't see why it would be any different. I'm sure there's data in these signals that just no one's thought to look, like you said.
Right. So how like you're in a scenario where you're working with a company that is trying to apply some technology and some machine learning. What drives people's interest? I mean, is it for example, when I think about pharmaceuticals, it's, well, if we come up with this drug, we're going to make a ton of money because everybody's got this disease, right? So what drives it, I guess, in our industry, like, or any offshoot of our industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be different for everyone. I mean, I could talk about what my motivations are, but I know working with athletes that want to push these boundaries, sometimes it's ego. They just want people to know they're the best or think they're the best. Other times it's people just wanting to see what could they do if they put their mind to something. I think everyone has different motivations. And I think based on people's motivations, they are more or less curious about knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So I don't think we could ever really know why different people do what they do, but
more from the standpoint of a business, like the business that you work for, why did they say, okay, we're going to pony up some money and we're going to look into this thing?
You're what I will say is our technology, it has many applications from like a fitness standpoint and a sports science perspective, but the reason that we developed it is actually Alzheimer's disease prevention.
Got it.
So we're trying to prevent and treat neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other conditions eventually. That's a big motivation. You could imagine why people would want to do that. Of course, there's a financial stake, but if you've ever seen someone go through those conditions, it's pretty awful. You would like to be able to prevent that. From the sports science perspective, the technology has so many dual uses that I could talk a little bit about some of the measurements that we use, but it becomes abundantly clear that health and disease are really two sides of the same coin. So the same technology that could be used to try and prevent X, Y, or Z disease could also be applied to try and improve sports performance, particularly because a lot of what this technology deals with is blood flow regulation in the microvasculature and certain molecules that dilate blood vessels both in the muscle, but also in the brain. And you can imagine where this has implications for exercise as well. So for me, working with this organization, my interest was largely thinking about disease at first, but I love training. I'm very interested in understanding why things work, and that naturally led to us trying to investigate athletics and most of the public facing side of the company, that's what people will see right now is the fitness applications of the technology.
Evan, you did a post on Instagram relatively recently, and you were kind of introducing the idea of the future of athletic training and talking about the integration and the schism between technology and athletes is going to be, very integral going forward. And I know you're kind of touching on that a little bit now. I was wondering, could you just kind of dabble on that a little bit more with what you can talk about?
Yeah, of course. So one of the things that I don't really work with, well, I was going to say many, but any athletes one-on-one right now. But when I did, one of the big problems that I ran into using these varying technologies is, I'll just be honest, I just ran out of time to actually analyze this data. So I would get one athlete and they would send me so much data that I'm like, man, if I really wanted to extract everything I could from this, I'm going to need 3 to 4 hours to do this. Now, when I'm working with 20 athletes at a time, you do the math.
Yeah.
So this is where I originally got interested in data science, and starting to understand how to use these different machine learning algorithms was really just so I didn't have to analyze any of the data myself. But I also realized there's a huge opportunity there, because we think of all these different aspects of an athlete's training. We have their strength training and conditioning training and X, Y, Z. You could collect different biomarkers for all of them. With all these dimensions of data, how do we know what is actually important? What is really accounting for the changes that we're observing? This is something that we could distill something called principal components analysis. You essentially take all of these dimensions and you say, how many of these 30 dimensions are accounting for 90% of the results or the variance that we're seeing? And you can distill those down. Now you know what the most crucial data points are. Or you could start to get really sophisticated with your predictions for injury prevention. As a human, I could look at an athlete and I could spot some very obvious things that I think are going to be a problem for someone. You watch someone lifting weights, they're front squatting, and all of a sudden they're rounding, they look like a human cashew. That's probably going to be an issue. But a lot of times, what about when you see an athlete and they look perfect, their form's on point, their velocity's good, and they just tear their ACL out of nowhere? Things like that do happen, particularly in high performance athletics and professional sports. And we want to try and explain things like that, but we don't always have the way to, because there's so many different factors happening simultaneously. I always liken it to a multi-car pileup on a freeway. You could see what happens. You could spot a few things that clearly made this accident happen, but you're not going to be able to prevent it from occurring again, because there's so many different things that needed to occur in exactly the precise order to have a 20-car pileup that you have no way of stopping it from happening.
Right.
Well, what if there is a perceptual system, and it doesn't need to be human, it could be human machine interacting together, that was able to account for all those variables? They could actually spot what's going to create this ripple effect and maybe create some kind of intervention. I think that's where I don't think any of this is ever going to replace the role of a practitioner in a high performance setting or a training setting. I think it's going to be an augmentation. So allow the machines to do things that machines are very good at, and allow humans to do the things that humans are very good at. Fortunately, we are not good at the same things. Machines are capable of doing tasks with a good amount of ease that a human mind could never do. But ironically, these same systems also fail at doing the most basic shit that a 4-year-old could do. So I think working together, that's where we could really start to become well-informed and understand how to manipulate training and interact with people to create some really big performance improvements.
Do you see some applications for what you're looking at now that might help with, I'll call it like baseline data, kind of like, getting somebody into a concussion protocol? You do your baseline neurological study. Yep. And say, okay, this is where you are before you hit your head. You hit your head. Let's see where you are now.
Yeah.
So do you see that kind of potential application with what you're currently looking at?
Yeah, I think that's one thing. And something like that requires a lot of different people's data, because you could see these changes and you don't necessarily know what is contributing to the disease phenotype that you're observing and what just happens to occur simultaneously. It's kind of like the mechanical tension, muscle damage kind of debate,
Yes.
where is
Yes.
muscle damage causing hypertrophy, or is it just a byproduct of mechanical tension? And I don't think the jury's fully out on that, but it's the same with all these technologies, which is why with AI or machine learning, there's a huge area of study, which is explainability, because these systems, looking at all these data points, they don't know anything. They don't know what they're actually looking at. What they're doing is finding statistical patterns and relationships and giving a result. It's up to the human to interpret that result and understand if it's even the meaningful result in the first place, which is a whole different can of worms. So I think that's where there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, particularly I've seen studies and I've consulted for some organizations in the past few years applying machine learning to different training tools. And a lot of times the results that it spits out are interesting, but they're not really useful. And sometimes the explainability of them is just boggles the mind. The results don't really make sense. And oftentimes that's either measurement error or it has to do with how they're collecting data. So it's a tricky topic.
Evan, like maybe more of a smaller step back, but on the technology, and I think the thing that I'm just so fascinated by with that, this is one thing that Jacques, you've done an incredible job with, but like you said, and you kind of also said, Evan, the amount of resources and also time, which is also a resource that's required to assimilate this data for a client, it's insane. Like even me messing around with dynamometers, which are relatively fast metric to collect, still takes time to look at the data, collate it, and figure out what to do with it. I'm just wondering, with the tech and the wearable world that you are aware of and thinking about in the future, is there a version of this for health and fitness professionals that you think will be a helpful tool to have and also help with their decision making working as an exercise professional?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know Jacques spent a lot of time with muscle oximetry as well. I've spent a lot of time with that. Jacques, think of how many hours you've probably spent reading integrated physiology research to make sense of these measurements. You basically have to do a PhD's worth of reading to be able to understand what's seemingly a very simple trend line. It's just that when you look at oxygen measurements in a muscle tissue, at face value, it's if oxygen supply is greater than utilization, oxygen levels go up. If utilization is greater than supply, oxygen levels go down. It's pretty straightforward. Is the line going up or down? But then you realize how many systems are actually influencing this process. And it becomes so complex and multifaceted that at the end of the day, you could spend a lot of time with these data trends and you end up coming to the conclusion of, well, there are these 10 possibilities and I spent the past 2 hours and I've narrowed it down to 2 of these. Yeah. And my degree of confidence is roughly 50-50, and that's still pretty good. Well, that's not that useful ultimately, because yes, Jacques could do this, I could do this, we could teach people to do it, but that's never going to scale. So the technologies that we've developed in the company I work for, Knox, we're using AI to actually automate the analysis. So the average person could collect data and they don't need to spend 2 hours analyzing it. It will spit out our best interpretation of that data. Furthermore, we have a feedback system. So in the past, I've used a lot of sports wearables that I get my data, I could export it to a CSV file, great. That's me collecting data on my own. The organization has no way of reanalyzing that data. So one of the things that we're working on at Knox is this is going to be anonymous. Users always own their own data, but they could opt to have us get a copy of that data back. So now if we have 100,000, 200,000 people collecting this data, now we have these intelligent machine learning systems that could analyze large swaths of people's data and know what their performance outcomes are over time. And now we could actually figure out what measurements in our signal are creating these performance outcomes, what are predicting injury, and now you could improve your power to both predict what's going to happen before it happens, but also when you could do that, you could make things happen because you know what the really important key pieces are that are driving the changes that you want to manifest.
You know what's really cool? I was just thinking about that. I was thinking about Whoop. Mm-hmm. I think they've done a really good job of using that kind of model to collect a whole bunch of data, give people a whole bunch of questionnaires that they can opt into, giving them more information so they can see how, your sleep, did you drink, how much caffeine, all that stuff affects this one measure, HRV. So yeah, that's really cool that you guys are going to do that. I love that. That's really cool.
Yeah, and that's what becomes interesting to me. Companies like Whoop, just companies doing these things in general, is you think of the amount of statistical power that they have, the hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many users, maybe millions of people's data that they're getting and correlating to these different outcomes. I mean, could you think of a single study in an exercise lab at a university that's had more than 100 people?
Right.
No. Could you think of one that the intervention has lasted more than 3 months? I could probably count them on one or two hands.
Right.
Now these companies are going to be able to follow hundreds of thousands of people for months to years at a time. And I think a lot of what we learn as exercise physiologists or coaches or athletes is going to come from these methods. I think there's still 100% a place for traditional lab-based research, but I think having this field-based research is also going to really help us create a more broad understanding of training.
Yeah, what I feel like you've helped me kind of put into words is to me the use of this technology is less about coming up with like the plan for someone. And I almost think of it more as a tool to educate my clients about how the best that we can do is come up with a hypothesis about what we think is going to work. And come up with a way of saying, if this is working, this is what we're going to expect to see change. And if it's not working, these things aren't going to change. We're going to change course, right? And these are all the different things that we can change, as opposed to the traditional thing of, well, here's my gym. This is what we do. And if you want to lose weight, we put you through this thing, and that's it. And if it's not working, it's because you ate after 6 o'clock. So it's because I've definitely have gone down that rabbit hole of spending hours of going through, data for a client only to say, well, that was interesting. Okay. And we still are just as clueless about the right way to go, but at least we have something that we can measure against once we get going.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is a lot of it. It's almost telling us what doesn't matter. And it's really just as useful. I mean, I could probably name 1,000 things, not literally, that I thought were really important at some point or another. And I spent a lot of time and effort micromanaging. And at some point, you're like, oh, this thing really doesn't matter. And it makes training that much more sustainable when you have less things that matter and you really could distill down the few things that do matter. So if we could do that for clients, I mean, think of how much more of a personal connection when we could have with someone. If I only have 2 hours with this person per week, man, if I could offload all of my data analysis and I don't need to think through all that, think of how much more deep of a connection you could have with them. And I think that really influences training a lot too. It's a very overlooked piece, but I think that's really a large part of what drives progress and what drives long-term client retention is not the fancy protocols that we give people. A lot of it is just whether your clients like you or not. And I think it's much easier to have people like you when you could actually have the time to ask them how they're doing and communicate with them. And I think these soft skills are generally quite overlooked.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That's it. That's it.
I think I was going to say, I think that the really interesting thing that you said there, I mean, if we have all of these different layers of data, like we might look at it with a one fresh first analysis and go, yeah, this is interesting. This is what we have. But then if we have that qualitative comparison of month or every quarter with a client of like a soft or daily, I'm not sure how this tech will work. It'd be very interesting to have that comparison to go, hey, listen, these numbers are down and we would have liked to see them at least stay the same or be up just a little bit. And opens up a whole pile of conversation and takes away those hours of time that you've spent. I mean, honestly, full disclosure, all the research that you've done, Jacques, with the Moxie stuff and everything there, I haven't gone down there because I just don't have the time to learn into the research. But I'll tell you, I'm a candidate to like invest and learn more because I want that data.
Yeah, it's I definitely think that it's more than just a notion to go and grab them and slap them on people, because there's something that this guy named Carlo De Luca said. He said he was referring to EMG, that it's kind of dangerous technology because it's so easy to use, but it's so easy to abuse. You know, you just slap it on and people think, now I know how your muscle is firing. It's like, no, you don't. Just settle down. So there's some similar things, I think, with the Moxie monitors, but they really do. There's something to be said, though, at least from a user standpoint, of when they see their physiology in action. When they see that, I'm feeling this part of my body really exerting, but when we look at what's happening metabolically, it's like it's far less significant than what's happening in this part of your body. And it's like, whoa, okay. And that's why this is changing and that's not changing. In the case of a bodybuilder, for example, or even in the case of someone who's trying to figure out like the return to play, they rupture their ACL and they feel like, they're ready to go, and you start to do some specific evaluations. You're like, no, you are not. This is not what it looked like before you ruptured your ACL. Or you're not within normal parameters.
Yeah, and I think what's useful about a lot of these technologies is a lot of the things that we see in underlying muscle physiology sometimes are things that you can't feel. So people don't even always know that there's a problem. One of the things that we developed at Knox, it's a bioactive nitric oxide measurement in tissues. And one of the things that I've seen is people could be years out from an ACL surgery and they still have compromised blood flow in the tissue. And what's really so fascinating is like you could see this so tangibly, and I could just say to an athlete that I don't even know, and I'm like, look, you keep re-injuring this leg. Like you don't get a pump in this tissue when you do hypertrophy training, and sometimes your kneecap is cold to the touch and like X, Y, and Z happens. And they're like, how the hell did you know any of that? Sometimes like when you put it all to words and you tie these things together, they're like, I didn't even know any of these things were relevant. And the funny thing is these athletes, their tissues almost become like metabolically inert. Most of the time they think that leg is the good one. So this is something that's been
Yes.
so fascinating to me.
Yes.
They're like, I think of a high-level hockey player that's data I have. A few years out from, let's say, right ACL surgery, this tissue looks metabolically inert on their right leg, on their quadriceps, but they're like, when I skate, my left leg feels like pumped in. I'm feeling like burning in my leg, and it's like getting super swollen, filled with blood. And they're like, my left leg is like a problem. It's always feeling pumped and like it's blown up after I skate. And like, I need to figure this out.
Mm-hmm.
I look at them and I'm like, your left leg's not the problem. Like that leg is actually the one that's getting blood flow. Like you feel a pump in that tissue because you're getting blood flow. You feel it burning because you're actually utilizing oxygen, getting acidosis. The leg that you don't feel anything, that's the problem for you. And I see that with CrossFit athletes too. Like half of the time that I would consult with people and they would say, oh, I have this limb that's the problem. It's always fatiguing. It's usually the good leg.
Yeah.
And that's something that's interesting about using those technologies is the thing that seems so obvious is actually wrong, and it's very counterintuitive.
You made me just think of something. So I feel like between stuff that I've come across and read and recommendations that you've made, Evan, I feel like if somebody came to me with a specific limiter, right, that they thought was their specific issue or something that I determined for them, then I would know how to design something intelligently that might move them along, that might create the adaptation that we're looking for. But what I hear you saying is that there are people that have an issue with this bioavailable nitric oxide, specifically in some tissues. And I'm wondering if the mechanical environment that creates the adaptation where they would have more nitric oxide, is it a receptor that we're looking for in that tissue? Is it the delivery of nitric oxide to that tissue? And then lastly, are the types of training that's needed to rectify that situation different than any of that other stuff?
Yes, I'll speak to the injured person first, and then let's
Okay.
just be a normal, ordinary person. So one of the things that happens sometimes when athletes get really catastrophic injuries, think of like an open compound fracture. I actually helped an athlete out with this recently. When you have a really traumatic issue like that, it's not just the bone that breaks, it's not just the ligament that tears. You
Right.
actually tear your blood vessels as well.
Right.
Now, typically when athletes go through return to play, and this is very common in professional sports, so you get your ACL surgery, all these different things, they'll do a bulk circumference measurement. They're like, oh, your quad is roughly equal circumference to your other leg, so that's good. They'll do isokinetic strength testing. So essentially, they'll put you in what looks like a leg extension, but you can't move it. It's just producing maximal force. And they'll say you're roughly even on both sides, X, Y, Z.
Right.
Oftentimes, athletes could regain strength on their compromised leg, but it doesn't mean that they've fully healed the blood vessels, or that they've gotten significant angiogenesis, forming more blood vessels where blood vessels currently exist. And as a result of that, they're still compromised in their ability to deliver blood and oxygen to those tissues.
Right.
And that's something that you don't see in the measurements traditionally done in
Right.
high-level athletics. So there is ways to return function there. For a normal person now, when I think of training that is going to help you increase bioactive nitric oxide levels or grow new blood vessels, think of it like think of the like Roman god Janus. It's like this two-faced god that like one face is looking this way, one face is looking that, where like a Goldilocks zone where there's a sweet spot. So in the literature, it's very clear that if you do very low intensity exercise, you're not going to get significant angiogenesis. If you do very high intensity exercise, you also do not get significant angiogenesis. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time doing is looking at gene chip data sets. So imagine we do an exercise science study and we're tracking all the normal stuff like performance outcomes and things like that. We could also take blood samples before and after, and we can look at RNA microexpression, so we could see what genes are being upregulated in response to training. Now, if we take 20 different people, put them on the exact same training program, and you look at basal levels of expression of a gene called VEGF-A, vascular endothelial growth factor A, upregulating this gene increases blood vessel growth. So from pre to post exercise intervention, some people's VEGF-A levels go up, other people's go down, other people stay even. Whoa, what do you know? There's like a dose-response relationship for increasing upregulation of this gene. Well, now what gets even dicier is these training studies. What you see is low intensity, most people don't get upregulation. Very high intensity, you see huge upregulation of VEGF-A, but people don't get blood vessel growth. What the hell's going on? We're seeing this thing going up and blood vessels aren't growing. Well, if you do high intensity, you also get an upregulation of genes that are anti-angiogenic. So you're upregulating the things that grow blood vessels, the things that counteract them, cancels each other out. There's a sweet spot in the middle where you're not getting the maximal VEGF-A expression, you're getting enough to stimulate the adaptation, and you're not getting those anti-angiogenic factors. So you're getting this sweet spot that's good for blood vessel growth. So for a lot of these adaptations, it's about finding that razor's edge of where you're exercising at a high enough intensity to drive these adaptations, but not too high. And this is where conditioning, so to speak, it's a little bit more complex, because with pushing a muscle, I mean, I know you could train too hard or at too high of an intensity to be optimal, but it's very rare that we would say, man, you're lifting with really great form, but you're lifting too heavy with perfect form and taking yourself to local muscle failure without technique breakdown. You don't get muscle hypertrophy. It's like, no, that doesn't really happen. Both conditioning, you could exercise too hard to get a very specific adaptation. And that's where, for optimizing these bioactive nitric oxide levels, it's very much about the right dose, the right duration, and things of that nature.
So for the angiogenesis thing that you just said there, because I mean, you said a bunch of things that made my brain blow up. So bear with me for a second while I try to catch up. But for the angiogenesis thing, so if someone's working on conditioning, If someone is like, for example, and maybe you could elaborate perhaps on like what too high intensity is, but are you talking about that hypertrophy example where if someone goes to complete peripheral local skeletal muscle fatigue with controlled exercise, or do you mean it perhaps more on the traditional cardiovascular end where someone is like, sprinting their body until it's into oblivion and they're not getting the angiogenesis, and there's a middle ground in between there, like submaximal sprint, that might be more effective for that adaptation?
Yeah, so this is where with conditioning specifically, it becomes so hard to even quantify intensity and really triangulate. Because you're like, well, are we using percentage of max heart rate, percentages of critical power? Like, what are we even talking about here? In different studies, use different measurements. So it's really hard to give any broad recommendation of what is optimal for angiogenesis. Now, keep in mind, going at a lower intensity or a higher intensity, you're going to get some degree of blood vessel growth. If you're relatively beginner, intermediate, you can even get it with weightlifting too. I mean, that's not the problem. It's for people who already have accrued this adaptation to a meaningful degree. That's where you need a more specific adaptation over time. But this is also, as like a kind of side note, I think one of the innovations that we're going to see in the next decade or two in the training space is going to be the ability to do high throughput sequencing. So right now you could actually get a micropore analyzer for like $1,000 or $2,000 that you could take blood and you could do one of these RNA microchip analysis. Now that takes a lot of very specific skill, a lot of computing power, so that's not practical. But imagine if this technology is shrunken down enough, the data analysis is automated enough that we could have you exercise. Then we could see how your gene expression changes. Now we're actually getting down to the molecular level, and we're saying, well, two of you, how are your genes changing in response to this exercise? Molecular exercise physiology is a large field right now, but it's totally a laboratory-based science. And again, you just can't collect that much data. Well, imagine if this technology becomes accessible to everyone and you could get very N of one with this. I think that's also going to be a way that we really individualize training, so we could see how genes are being upregulated, what genes are counteracting those, and you could get so nuanced and precise. And now if you have wearables that have easily tracked measurements that correlate with these changes in gene expression, now you have something that you could actually use in your exercise session to guide your outputs to create these certain training responses.
I got to be honest, I want to see those genes with me and Jacques so I can see what's going on within Jacques so I can CRISPR my way over to him so that way I can look that good when I'm his age. Because dang, man. But
I'm
this
just
sounds...
Hey, man, listen, but then you have a little stripe down your nose. It would get a little weird, So here's my question. I this is like fascinating. That is explains a couple of things about the sweet spot for VEGF. What I'm wondering is if you've come across anything about so there are these other hormones that are produced as muscles contract, including irisin, BDNF, IGF, and yeah, those are the ones that are at the top of my head. But I'm wondering if they also have specific parameters. The general points in terms of when those things are produced have to do with that of the working tissue. But I'm wondering, are there also parameters of if it's too high or not high enough, you don't get any of that stuff?
No, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head because I've never thought to look at it, but I do have access to a lot of these gene chip data sets. I've specifically looked into a lot of these studies and looked at the VEGF data just because that's something that I think a lot about is blood vessel growth. It's more a little bit up my alley for research focus, but I could go back through those gene chip data sets and see if they have the relevant genes for what you're talking about. It's not too hard to do.
Awesome. Or if you want to, like, I don't know what it would entail to look at these data sets, but I'm happy to do it too. That's super cool because the last time I checked in on the parameters for the efficacy of like I knew that there are conditions where you could produce those hormones and for some reason they just didn't do their thing, right? It was as if it was as if you got all the stimulation, but somehow those hormones just disappeared or weren't effective. And the last time I looked into it, they were all talking about that in the context of stress. So if as you're doing this exercise, you perceive it as a emotionally, physiologically stressful event, and you're hating every minute of it, then that's when the efficacy of these hormones are undermined. But you're speaking to another important variable, and that is just the genetic expression.
Yeah,
cool.
and this is where, like, again, one of the reasons why I think machine learning is going to be really helpful with doing these types of explorations is that cells are complex. I mean, if you imagine we're driving through a city right now and there's an accident in front of us and the street's blocked off, we're pretty screwed. We're going to sit there in our car for the next 4 hours because the street's blocked off. Or if there's construction, if you imagine a cell and it's like this city grid map, well, when a street's blocked off, there's always another option. You could drive onto the sidewalk and get around the accident. So in cells, you could bind certain receptors with an agonist or antagonist. You can knock out these certain pathways, and there's so much redundancy, which is why we'll often see these different cycles of, for blood flow regulation, ATP release from the red blood cell. That is the thing that vasodilates tissue. You knock that out, tissue still vasodilates. Shit. Oh, no, it's potassium that's vasodilating the tissue. You knock that out. Oh, shit, the tissue's still vasodilating. So this is where it becomes so complex, and we're talking about the human body is all of these different redundancies. I mean, just the limits of what we could do in an experiment on human beings. They're not going to let you knock out all of these known vasodilators in tissue. So it's really hard to really understand what's going on at a deep level.
So circling back to, I think your original point is that in response to this idea that is there something about if you're trying to simulate the adaptation that that drives the tissue to either assimilate more, would that be the right way? Nitric oxide, so that you get better blood flow to that tissue. It would be similar to the exercise conditions that would facilitate an increase in the production of VEGF.
Yes, yeah. So the specific bioactive form of nitric oxide that I'm interested in is released from the red blood cells into the tissue that causes vasodilation. That tends to be coupled with VEGF. So if we think of magnitude of this form of nitric oxide being released and duration of release, so magnitude over time, that tends to correspond to increases in VEGF expression. And that's where talking about things that we could measure and what we could correlate back to gene expression data, something that I'd like to do over time, is figure out exactly how this relationship works. So if we could measure this bioactive form of nitric oxide, and it does track well with this gene expression data, now we have a measurement that's useful. So if I want an athlete to improve peripheral capillarity in a tissue, I could give them a measurement that they could actually watch on their phone, and they could increase their power, decrease, know when to rest, know when to start again to actually maximize this adaptation.
Listen, guys, I gotta say, I think this is maybe a good time for us to slowly start to put a pin in this thing for today. But I want to say too quickly one thing, and then let Jacques, because I know Jacques probably might have. I want to give you one more big question, dude, because I think you got probably something special up your sleeve there. But what I will say, two things. I mean, first and foremost, Evan, whenever the things that you are working on start to get ready for market, please, if you are open to it, I know the two of us would love to do this again and talk about it and help to expose whatever you're creating to our little community of people, because I don't know what it is entirely, but if it does even a percentage of what we're talking about today, it's going to be really, really game-changing and revolutionary.
Oh, yeah, I would love to. I'm happy to share with you guys once the time is right.
Do you have any idea of timeline? Are we looking like 10 years?
Much sooner than that. I could say near-ish future, but I can't give you a specific date.
Well, in the nearest future, we will have you on again.
Okay, perfect.
And then the second thing I was going to say that I want to like double back and connect this with Jacques, because you guys were talking about that occlusion potentiation thing. I think that just sounds like a ridiculously cool experiment. And I'm super interested in hearing more about that data and just seeing how that connects. So yeah, and that'd be super cool.
Yeah, I would love to get that data. And if Jacques, if you need someone that is willing to get blood flow to their legs cut off, I'm perfectly happy to do it. I'm not happy to say, but for work, I regularly have to cut off arterial blood flow in my legs for testings. I'm the only guinea pig in my lab with COVID, so happy to do it again for you.
Wow. Okay, cool. Where are you again?
I'm in Providence, Rhode Island. So.
Providence. Okay, cool.
Sounds like you guys got to make this happen. I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, that could be fun.
Or you guys could come up to Toronto, Canada, and hang out, because we're like super close and there's nothing, easy to get here.
Toronto, huh? Toronto's a hot city, man. No, it's fun. I like going up to Toronto.
Not bad. It's not bad at all.
Yeah. Wow.
I'll pick you up on my way to cross the border. I think I need to probably go past you to get up to Canada.
And I'll have maple syrup and poutine ready for you guys.
That's awesome.
Sounds delightful. Pre-workout.
Let's go.
This is so good. This is so good. Yeah.
All right, cool. We'll tell you what, guys. Why don't we leave this for today? And then the next time we come on, we'll talk to Evan about his incredible technology that we're all going to spend too much money on. And we're going to change some lives.
Sweet. Sounds good.
Sounds good to me.
Jacques, Evan, thank you so much for being a part of this and doing this. These group chats are a lot of fun, and you guys are both wizards. So I learned a ton today. So thank you both very much.
Yeah, that was fun, guys. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Everyone, check out the Fitness Pro Mentors podcast, because we're going to have this stuff on, and you're going to want to buy what Evan's got coming. It's going to be awesome.